You to all of you for joining us on this Monday lunchtime. And no, we're all getting used to this new style of Labour Party conference online. You may have been to some of these meetings already. If not, welcome to your first experience. This is part of the Fabian Society's Fringe at Labour Connected. And the topic of today's meeting is Thinking Global, Growing Local. What are the COVID-19 lessons for food and farming? And we're delighted to be hosting today's meeting in partnership with the NFU. It couldn't be a sort of a more important time for this conversation. Obviously, earlier this morning, we heard about the latest developments in COVID-19 from the government scientists and the likelihood that social restrictions will continue for some time to come. But there have already been major implications for the food and farming sector of the pandemic and of our response as a society and an economy to the pandemic. Now looking ahead to 2020, that this is going to be with us for some time to come. What does it mean for the food and farming sector? And on top of that, of course, we have Brexit, which again has been the topic of headlines over the last couple of weeks in a way that hadn't been the case for the previous 3 months or so. Now really concerned about the prospects for a free trade agreement between the UK and the EU, and thinking very hard about whether that will be achieved and what it will mean for the food and farming sector, what it will mean in particular as a successor to the Common Agricultural Policy. And if that all wasn't enough, we also have to think about this in a political context. This is an event focused on the Labour Party, and Labour obviously has been doing very poorly in farming and rural communities for a very long time. But this election in 2019, the party took another step backwards in terms of its representation and vote in rural and farming communities. Of course, it's not a direct link between having a great policy for agriculture and being electorally successful in rural communities. But if you can't get one, you certainly won't have the other. So we will be picking up a little bit of the politics of all this, as well as some really important policy questions. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our panel. We're delighted to be joined by Daniel Zeichner MP, who is the Labour Party's Shadow Minister for Food and Farming. Then we'll be hearing from Stuart Roberts, who is the Vice President of the NFU. Then we'll be hearing from Jackie Jones, who was until very recently a MEP, so with expertise from all of the EU side of this policy agenda, but also the MEP for Wales. And I think she'll be saying something about the approach that the Welsh government is exploring in this area. And finally, we'll be hearing from Councillor Doina Cornell, who is the leader of Stroud District Council, which is, I believe, one of only 2 rural authorities that the Labour Party currently runs. So to hear her perspectives, both on the policy and the political questions that Labour needs to tackle to rebuild in rural England and Wales. So lots to get on with. Just a quick word on the logistics. You've probably now done a million of these Zoom meetings. The way we'll do them is, if you want to ask a question, and I hope you will, after we've heard from our panel, please could you type that into the Q&A function in your Zoom thing, and what we'll do is pick out a few of the best and ask that you to come in and ask your own question. And now, if we can't make the technology work and bring you in, I might have to read it out for you, but we're hoping that we'll be able to get you in to do that for yourself. So that's all the sort of introduction out of the way, and let's get straight into hearing from Daniel about the Labour Party's view on food and farming in the context of COVID and, of course, Brexit.
Well, thanks ever so much, Andrew, and welcome to everybody today. I have to say, it's a conference like no other. I'm already missing the Fabian sausage rolls and white wine, but we're going to make the best of it. And I'm going to start by waving my wheat sheaf, which you'll see Stuart wearing, because it's only a week or so since Back British Farming Day. And crikey, don't our farmers need it at the moment. It is an awful confluence of difficult circumstances, weather that's been bad and challenging for the last few years, in fact, but still difficult. And as you alluded to, Andrew, an extraordinarily uncertain landscape in so many ways. And in the next 4.5 minutes, I'm just going to touch on some of those things. I do think the issue of Brexit and the fact that we're rushing towards the end of the year with no certainty is really, really serious. Let's be clear, I'm sure Stuart will say more of this, about this, the tariff issues would be really, really serious for many sectors of British farming. Of course, nowhere is that more the case than in Northern Ireland, where the lack of clarity around the protocol is raising real fears, and in fact some supermarkets actually talking about not being able to move food in and out. So it's really, really serious. Alongside that, I think there's been more discussion around our food system recently than I can remember in many a year. A House of Lords report that described the system as broken, which is pretty strong words. Henry Dimbleby's report, or part one of it, which a bit like Marcus Rashford identified that child poverty and the appalling number of children who are in households where food is an issue in one of the richest countries in the world, very much subscribes to that notion that there is something wrong with our food system. And of course, for people involved in the policy arena, this is an extraordinary week, because tomorrow night there will be votes in the House of Lords, which could well send back to the House of Commons some amendments demanding that minimum standards are enshrined in UK law. This, in shorthand terms, is the chlorinated chicken, hormone-fed beef debate, but also likely to be other amendments beefing up, if I may say so, the Agricultural Trade Commission, which was announced a few weeks ago, which I'm afraid we think is a bit of a fig leaf and is only going to be useful if it actually has real power. And of course, as Dimbleby said, absolutely needs parliamentary scrutiny over those final trade deals. This is huge politics. This is geopolitics. This is the arm wrestling with Trump, with China and all the rest of it. So it goes well beyond agriculture. And of course, alongside that, there's the minor issue of a complete change to the agricultural support regime. I took the Ag Bill through the Commons for Labour, talked at length about our the environmental land management schemes, which are widely supported, but very, very vague, and still no clarity, despite the consultation finishing only a couple of weeks ago. And farmers are going to face cuts in their support systems from next year. So a really, really difficult time. And alongside that, of course, we've got the migration and labour issues, which meant that we had the big problem earlier in the year when the government launched its Pick for Britain scheme. Many of us were a bit dubious about how well that would work, and I think it's rather been borne out, and it was fortunate we were able to get some of those migrant workers back again in time. And if that's not enough, just look what's happening in the meat processing sector with COVID at the moment, with a whole range of related issues there. And if that's not enough, just look at what's going to happen if we don't have any vets. And remember that half our vets come from the EU and 95% of our meat inspectors in those abattoirs come from the EU. And then there's African swine fever on the horizon. So I think one of the questions was, what could DEFRA do differently? Well, probably quite a lot, frankly. And I'll just give you a few. I think put those food standards into law, a 1 million strong petition run by the NFU, widespread public support. They should just do it in our view. A bigger, perhaps, question still is how do we address the unfairness across the food chain? Farmers get a very small amount of money. The supermarkets at the top of that chain have huge power. Yes, there is consultation on trying to change some of those power relationships in the dairy sector. We think the grocery code adjudicator's role could be expanded. I know she takes a different view, but something needs to be done to address that unfairness. And most of all, I would say, I think we need to grow more of our fruit and vegetables here as we really address food insecurity. And finally, because I suspect I've only probably got about 30 seconds left, is that minor question of how Labour returned to government by winning seats in rural areas. Well, there's no magic to that. I would just comment, and I think you alluded to this, Andrews, remember rural voters aren't that different from urban voters. They really care about their health services, they care about their schools, their transport, their public services, their pensions, crime, and so on. So it's not all about rural policy, but as you said, Andrew, rural policy matters. I think also the changing role of market towns. There's a lot of talk about people moving out of cities. This is a great opportunity. I remember a Labour government had a market towns initiative. Well, those kind of things need to be returned to, I think, to make this happen. And then my final observation would be, in the countryside, Labour needs to be involved, to be there, to putting up candidates in elections. And most important of all, we need to be listening, not telling. Because I think our values actually are very close to a lot of people's values in non-urban areas, but people in the last few years haven't felt we are the party for them, and it's my job to change that.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So lots to get our teeth into there as we progress the discussion. But I'm delighted to bring in Stuart Roberts, who's the Deputy President of the NFU, to give the perspective from British agriculture.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And one of the exam questions you set opening this up was how does Labour gain support back in rural areas? Well, the first thing is actually understanding the issues. And Daniel, you have just set out all the issues at least as well as I can, if not even better. So I'm not going to repeat everything you've already said. You said at the end of your talk, the first thing is about listening. You definitely have listened. The discussions we've had over the years, you've picked up. But what I wanted to pick up in particular was what is it we've learned, particularly from COVID. That's what we're here to discuss. I think it is important, and both Andrew and Daniel have already picked this up. You can't see COVID in isolation. You have to look at it in the context of Brexit. You can't ignore that. I think also, particularly when it comes to agriculture, the issues around climate change and all of these things will influence agriculture going forward. But what have we actually learned during COVID? Well, what we learned, first of all, was different sectors were affected very differently. So something like the ornamental sector, growing plants for garden centres when garden centres weren't open, clearly was devastating. In the milk sector, very, very different effects from real devastation in some sectors to actually growing demand in other sectors, depending on whether your milk was going through coffee shops or through retailers. But other sectors where actually there's been relatively limited effects. And actually, if you take agriculture as a whole, when it comes to COVID, there's many parts of the economy that arguably have been harder hit than many in agriculture. We did have some very big supply chain challenges, switching from ballpark half and half of food eaten out of home and eaten in home, virtually all of it being bought through retailers and in home. The fact that we struggled not with flour, but actually we've struggled with bagging of flour, because actually a lot of flour comes in 25 kilo bags. And whilst I like bread, I don't buy 25 kilo bags of flour. Similarly, we found with meat a big imbalance in the carcass. So which bits of meat we were buying at retail were different to what we historically bought when we went out to the pub on a Friday night. I also think COVID potentially could have a very positive legacy when it comes to agriculture and food. I think we have seen, I think it can be a catalyst for interest in food. I think we've seen a record interest in people who are interested in where food came from. I think the 1 million people on the trade petition that you mentioned, Daniel, was part of that. We're seeing record levels of farmer appreciation amongst wider society. And that's simply because we've just done our job. We've not done anything particularly special during COVID. We've just fed people. And that's what farmers ultimately were put on this earth to do. But I also think there's been a couple of other areas, and one in particular that's been very interesting has been around access to the countryside. So I farm in a very rural location. I'm 24 miles north of Marble Arch. I have seen more people on my farm during the last 6 months than I have ever seen in my life. Now, this is where I am supposed to do the impression of a caricature of a farmer and say, get off of my land. But I don't. Actually, we welcome those people. We have seen people who actually, their one relief in the depths of lockdown, being able to get out into the countryside, enjoy the countryside, enjoy our access. And we've been really proud to be able to do that. And I think actually seeing where food is produced from and being able to come out and enjoy that and understand what else we're doing in terms of the countryside has been a very big impact. Alongside that, we have seen, unfortunately, some irresponsible behaviour and in some areas an increase in crime, which have been extremely bad effects. The last point I wanted to touch on, and I wanted to emphasise something Daniel talked about, which was this issue around food poverty. And I think we talk about an issue of food poverty. For me, food poverty doesn't exist, okay? Poverty exists. It just happens, it manifests itself in food choices, I believe, because actually it's the thing that people are faced with 3 times a day. And I think one of the things that COVID has demonstrated to us all, and probably the volume on it has been turned up, which can only be a good thing in terms of addressing the issue, is that inequality that exists, and particularly inequality potentially in food choices. So look, there's a few thoughts from me, and I look forward to expanding on that as we continue with the discussion.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And now let's go to our second Labour politician, and that's Jackie Jones, to give us a perspective both from Brussels and from Wales. Hi, Jackie.
Hi, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a great honour and privilege to be here. Daniel and Stuart have already outlined quite a lot of the comments, so I want to just give a few comments about the devolved situation, because I'm sitting here in the middle of Cardiff in Wales, a beautiful day. As you know, a lot of agriculture policy is devolved, and we have a Welsh Labour government here that's been in power for 20 years. Let me say straight away that I'm very proud of a Welsh Labour government. Of course, we can always do things better. And my final remark, which I'm going to say now because I think I'll probably run out of time, knowing me, is that we should work in partnership much closer and continuously, and review those partnerships as well as we go along. Because as you said, Stuart, it's not just one thing. There are many parts to this dilemma, if you like, or challenges that we face, and a lot of them are new, but some of them are not new at all. So here in Wales, we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015 that puts the Sustainable Development Goals on a statutory footing. And as a lawyer, I'm really, I think it's really important to have the basis of law, and I'm really concerned about the announcements last week and the week before by the UK government about breaching international law and breaching standards, and the Justice Secretary, etc. So I'll put that on the table. So it's within that context that I'm also making these remarks. I think that piece of legislation, plus others that we have, is about protecting current and future generations. And that obviously includes the farmers who are on the farms themselves as well. It's not just about the production and producing something for someone else. It's about the farming community and their well-being too. So food security and standards are very, very important. There's about 60,000, I believe, people employed in the farming sector in Wales, and in the food and drinks industries worth about £6 billion in Wales a year. Roughly, they might be slightly different now, I'm not sure, but those are the figures that I found. And the majority of farms, of course, in Wales are family farms and hill farming as well. So these are slightly maybe different concerns to other parts of the UK as well. The reliance on seasonal workers is ginormous, of course, as well, but that's throughout the UK. So when it comes to the EU and international perspective, because there are many layers of this, there's international perspective, there's the regional perspective, there's the UK perspective, and the devolved perspective as well. These are all different things that have to work symbiotically together alongside all of the other supply chain issues that we have. It's imperative, in my view, of course, to have a good trade deal with the European Union. We can't have a single market, we can't have all of those things. I'll put those things aside because there's no point in talking about it at the moment. We've left. But those trade deal details really impact on the farming community. For example, and of course I've only got a few minutes to say, seasonal workers and the threshold of 30,000 or 25k that has been set for skilled workers, and the border controls that are coming in. The maintaining the food standards for me is a very important one, and that resonated with across the board with voters in the last election for the European Parliament. Indeed, access to our closest markets, the EU is the closest market, and of course Ireland as well, is a really, really important aspect of any solutions that we come up with in the Labour Party. The supply chain issues, not just producers, but supermarkets and the checks on borders, all of those things have to be thought through alongside the farming community. So sustainabilities and the changes to COVID are also major, major challenges. Annalise Dodd's speech this morning talked about targeted wage support for the hardest hit and critical for the economy. I would say, I haven't seen the detail obviously because it just happened this morning, but I would suggest that the farming community is part of that, part of the hardest hit, and maybe, well, whether it's a Welsh government or a UK Labour government can do something there to financially support them. And it's not just about financial support, although I would say that that's a crucial part of it. It's also about structural support. So for example, where can Labour government step in and step up to help build long-term policies that sustain and grow farming and make use of existing channels as well, because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So financially, yes, but structurally too. And that is building a sustainable supply chain that is crucial to the, or is responsive to the market as it changes. And that may be COVID, but it may be something else next year. So it's making sure that those lines of communication are open where solutions are doable. And I know that when you look at across the globe and in Europe in particular, Norway, Sweden and other countries have done quite innovative work with the online stores and Facebook and getting farmers to sell directly to individuals as well as producers and further up the chain. So bypassing some of those structures that frankly some of them are not fit for purpose. But that doesn't mean you throw out the whole process. You have to work within the system, but to change it as it progresses. So direct sell delivery systems, I think, are one way that Labour can help. And of course, all of these things are about the buzzword connectivity. So broadband is a major issue in Wales and I'm sure across the UK in rural areas. And I think investment by a future Labour government and by the Welsh government in broadband and more social media outlets and all of those things to help structurally farmers, even if they have to go onto the farm and put it in themselves, I would say is very important. So I also think some of the new innovations in aeroponics and food standards, of course, we have to hold the line on those. And I've got a warning of 10 seconds. So I'll just finish with this, which is the beginning that I wanted to say. I do think it's doable. I absolutely do. I'm a very positive person. So I think it's absolutely there. And there are ideas out there already and new ones that we can come up with. And critically, I think that the solutions should come from the farming community, working in partnership with the new Labour government, which will come very, very soon. So I thank you very much for the invitation and for the ability to speak today.
Jackie, thank you very much. And just before I turn to Doina, just to remind you that we still want your questions and answers typed into the Zoom Q&A function. And you can also vote on other people's. So if there's a question that someone else has asked that you think is particularly good, if you give it a thumbs up, then I will endeavour to call the questions that are most popular. Now, let me turn finally to Doina. So Doina is the leader of Stroud Council, and as I said a minute ago, sadly, one of very few significantly rural councils that Labour runs. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Quite a hard act to follow. There's some really good stuff in there. So yeah, if you're not familiar with Stroud District, we cover the south of Gloucestershire, a really beautiful district between the River Severn and the edge of the Cotswolds, with a mixture of market towns, lots of really small communities. So hopefully that gives me some authority to speak today. I think there's lots of really big topics you've heard. So I think I'll perhaps look at it, what it looks like from local government's point of view. It's a vast topic, so I try to sort of pick out a few headlines which hopefully sort of address some of the questions today. And just to begin sort of around the impact of COVID for us, I think one of the things that I think it really highlighted was the lack of resilience within our rural communities. And so, and the other aspect is the whole question of equality. So we saw sort of certain parts of the community much more negatively impacted than others. So there are some negative things that came out of it. And of course, we know that local businesses in some instances have been extremely hard hit. But I'd also like to focus on the positive stuff we've seen. I think what we've saw is coming to the fore some fantastic work within our small communities to support people, our most vulnerable residents, and a very strong local ethos. I think that's something we've seen in our district, that's something that came very much to the fore. And I think was mentioned before about people now seeing the countryside as much more of an attractive place to live, and people aren't so keen on cities right now. And it's perhaps reflected in the fact in our district cases remain relatively low. For whatever reason that might be. And I think that's the element of not feeling lost in an anonymous part of in a city. You know your patch, you know the people you live with and work with, and I think that's come to the fore. So that's a positive part of it. And I think that those businesses, I can think of two practical local examples, who were negatively impacted, reflected on that, responded well. And for example, I can think of a local vineyard we've got, or a local flour mill, how they responded, did lots of local deliveries. So I think some that responsiveness to the crisis in some ways was fed into our local ethos. And I think there were some good examples of where food producers, for example, did their best. Obviously elsewhere we've seen difficulties for some. So I think that's something I'd like to see not lost when hopefully we come out of this. From a local government point of view, when I was reflecting on the questions, I think that food, and we've heard a lot about the big picture around food and all the issues related to it, doesn't sit very high up the local government agenda. We talk a lot about homes and jobs, which is equally important for rural communities as they are for anywhere else. But actually, when do we really sort of highlight food and the question of feeding people as one of our top things? And I think obviously it's another basic need that we need to fulfill. So what I think we ought to see is that coming up the agenda far more than it currently does. I sit for hours on end having discussions around providing homes for people within rural communities, and we do a lot of that in our council, and how we support the local economy. But I think that's one fundamental thing that probably we should focus on more. One of the things I also wanted to talk about was not necessarily seeing rural areas, or I speak for my own district, which is politically quite diverse. I'm a council of no overall control. So we run the council for the last 8 years with myself, Labour, Lib Dems and Greens, but the Conservatives are equally quite strong and very much involved in many of the decisions that we make as a council. So not seeing it all as a homogenous community. I think that's also quite important. In Stroud, many different people live on the community. In the community, we've got Labour members who feel very much part of that rural community, and perhaps right at the end I'll address how do we win in these rural areas. And I think there's sort of narrative that tends to see Labour as sort of an other that doesn't have some of those values at its heart, and I think we really need to address that. I mean, one example, for instance, a very live issue for us currently is around the badger cull. So what you've got is you've got different views within the community, but equally valid, I think, and it's not necessarily saying that there is one view. You've got farmers who think the cull is wrong and farmers who perhaps think it's should go ahead. But I think sort of unpicking that as well and understanding, and often as Labour, what's our view, let's be informed and let's take a view on it. I think that's quite important. Another thing, as a council and our district, we're very aware of all the environmental issues, and we talk a lot about transition with the local economy, but do we talk about transition for farming as much as we should? And how is we seeing that response to changing demands? Obviously there's a rise in interest in sort of vegan, vegetarian alternative diets, and I think goes back to my point about the lack of resilience that we're seeing. I mean, for example, more and more people drink oat milk. I mean, I would have thought oats were the obvious thing that you could be growing locally. I think Stroud's agriculture as a whole in the district is relatively mainly focused in dairy. I think recently I saw an article about how dairy farmers are looking possibly to move into that. So how as we as a local council could support that when we talk about transition from an environmental point of view? Are we including food within that? And I'm not sure we are. Going back to my point about not seeing farming as homogenous, that necessarily all farmers are all about meat and dairy. I know that's extremely significant for some, but there are other farmers for whom they want to go down a different route, and how do we support them as well? Because I think that's the way we can build in a better resilience into the community. And I think in Stroud you'll find lots of really good examples of that, because we've got a very proud tradition of having alternative views on things and trying out different models of small community farms where we've got communities can take shares in those, micro dairies, all different sorts of alternative of ways of doing things. And I thought exploring those as well. I think if you tap into the whole community wealth building agenda, which obviously is very, very much something that Labour has been talking about in recent years. We've been inspired, for example, by places like Preston. Very much, again, we're talking about the economy, but are we actually looking at what community wealth building means in rural areas? That's about having short supply chains. It's about keeping the wealth within the area. And I think very much the whole sort of agriculture is very much set up in a different way. I think we should be looking at that as well as how we look at it in the sort of more, what we do for other elements of the economy. And I think in our district, that's the sort of thing that we're exploring right now. We've got lots of local people who are very much engaged in that, seeing that local is positive, local is good, and how do we build that within our community. A couple of other quick points I'd like to make, as well as around farming, is also looking at relationship with landowners. To give you two positive examples where I think good partnership between the council and landowners has delivered results for local people. One is around housing. We've got a couple of active community land trusts, one of which worked with a local landowner to get some land to build a few homes for local people. And another one is around the whole question of flooding, very, very important, I know, for farmers. We've pioneered the rural SUDS, which is the sustainable drainage system, which was recently cited as an exemplar in the government published its strategy recently around flood management. And so again, one of the reasons for that success was really good working with landowners who very much bought into seeing those of you who aren't familiar with what that is. It's very much about building natural defences right upstream. So, you know, things like sort of you know, pools and leaving trees falling down, so you sort of stop the impact. And we've seen a positive impact on the down water river parts of our community, that it's sort of reduced the flooding. So just to give a sort of contrast to that, I was up in Yorkshire a while back and was talking to someone about it, and the issue where it wasn't working there was the fact, because of the whole, that's a big topic I know about, grouse moors and everything, the landowners weren't very keen to engage with that. So good relationships from a local authority with landowners is also extremely important to deliver on some of those key policies. And finally, as I mentioned, that whole issue around the environment and going forwards about the changing climate, which I know is probably right up farmers' agenda. And as a council that has, you know, having so many green councillors, a hugely important topic for local people. And going back to the point about how do you win in local areas, the environment is something that really matters to people. Again and again, when we do surveys of our local residents, two things come right up the agenda. One is people really like where they live and they value where they live, and also they you know, the environment is a key concern for them. And so how do we support farmers within that? The work that we're doing as a council, how do we move towards becoming a carbon neutral district? How is the agricultural sector involved in that? I think is really important. And also farming isn't simply about growing things, it's also about that whole rewilding agenda. How do we support farmers? How do we work on bringing some of those things back? Because we see that as a crucial part of the carbon neutral agenda, about locking carbon into nature, which is whether through having more trees or leaving areas to return to wilderness. And I know that's that's starting to sort of be on the agenda now, but I think it's also quite important. And how do we support some of that land to go back to that? Because we would just recognise the value to the planet, if you like, of doing those things. So those are just a few things from sort of my point of view, looking at it locally and what I've learned over the last few years of being sort of representing a small town in Gloucestershire. And finally, around the whole question of winning, we've got crucial local elections coming up next year, and I think we very much see those as sort of a sort of touchstone for Labour as how we are doing. And I think we're obviously fighting to hold control of our council, so absolutely important for us. I think a couple of things I would say on that. I think some of the values and challenges that have been mentioned today are absolutely as crucial for rural communities as they are for anywhere else. And I think Labour has some really important stuff to say. In rural communities, one of our biggest challenges around infrastructure, people having access, I think we've got 30 seconds left, access to good transport. I mean, we have major issues with buses and trains, you know, people not being able to access if they need to get out for jobs and things like that. So infrastructure is something that Labour should be telling the story really strongly. The whole question around equalities, that the constant issue for people in our smaller communities is they don't have the same access to services as the larger areas, and that's something that, you know, we need to address. And I think Labour can absolutely tell that story. And around linked to that, around the exclusion that was mentioned about broadband, for instance, ensuring that people are not digitally excluded as well. So I think there's some really important things that we as Labour can be saying. But finally, I would just say that you know, as Labour representatives, it's just about being embedded in your community and just being part of it and really speaking for that community. It is possible to do that as you know, you can win in those smaller countryside areas. It just doesn't mean just being there and just being responsive to what's going on and just being part of it and supporting them and being their voice. So it can be done. It's hard work, but I think there's absolutely no reason why we can't certainly on the local government, from the local government point of view, come back and see some significant gains and defend what we've already got in our areas.
Thank you so much, Donna. And that's really nicely rounded it off by bringing it back to the politics of it all. Now, lots of you have asked questions. Democracy in action. I'm going to bring in Abby Kay because she's got the most popular question. Abby, can you ask your question?
Sure thing. Thanks very much. There are many challenges for the food and farming industry on the horizon. How can the Labour Party make sure it's holding the government to account effectively and actually secure meaningful changes when the Conservatives have such a huge majority in the Commons?
And I also want to bring in David Walsh. David, are you there? Hi, David. Can you... You're on mute.
Oh, yeah. Yes, so my question was that we've had a whole collection of reports in the last few weeks that show the potentially catastrophic wildlife loss in the UK and around the world, including in WWF's Living Planet report, and shocking news in recent days that no rivers in the UK are of good chemical standards. So what can farmers and the Labour Party do together to keep the pressure on government to ensure we meet the so-called triple challenge of biodiversity loss, climate change, and growing enough food to meet growing populations' needs?
And then one more question before I go back to the panel. There's from Adam Deister, which is a question specifically for Stuart. Hi, Adam. Is your go ahead.
Sorry. Obviously, great to see the NFU's petition and the huge numbers of people that have signed up in support of protecting standards in British law. So I suppose we know that in the laws there are going to be two main questions on trade, one on the Agriculture Commission and one on Labour's amendment on protecting standards. So I wonder whether the NFU will be briefing in support of both of those.
So that's quite a wide range of questions already. I'd really like our panelists to address very briefly, either all of them or just one, but just try to speak for 30 seconds so we can get back for some other questions. Daniel, could I start with you?
Yeah, let me take David's and Abby's questions. The climate emergency should be at the top of everyone's agenda, and these reports over the last few weeks have shown just how worrying and urgent it is. So we need to strengthen every bit of legislation. I'm very worried about the Environment Bill, for instance. It's late, it's got some good stuff in it, but it's not nearly strong enough. And we're still worried that the Office of Environmental Protection is not going to replicate the European safeguards that we're losing by leaving the European Union. So it needs much stronger action from government. And that leads me on, in some ways, to Abby's question, which is one that every Labour MP every morning wakes up thinking, you know, what are we doing when we can't win any votes? And the answer is twofold, I'd say. One, in the House of Lords, we are winning votes. On the Ag Bill last week, not widely reported, but on food security and on a national food plan, we will pursue those in the Commons when they come back. But you're only going to make progress if you can win some Conservative backbenchers over. And we did see a rebellion on the Agriculture Bill, about 20 MPs, including Rishi Sunak, by mistake, it has to be said, in the remote voting period. But I think there are many Conservative MPs who are deeply troubled, particularly around the food standards issue. And I pay tribute to NFU and Stuart and his colleagues who are putting pressure on because they know there is a fundamental problem there. And for a lot of their constituents, this is not some hypothetical issue. It really, really matters. And there is an agenda, I'm afraid, from the Conservative government. You know, at its most extreme, it was that leak saying, you know, we don't need to grow food anymore in this country. We can be like Singapore. Now, I don't think that's the view of either the government or the vast majority, certainly the vast majority of Conservative MPs. They are appalled. So what Labour's got to do is make constructive criticism, win allies where we can and win battles where we can, but most of all put ourselves in a position where we're competitive for the next general election. In the meantime, it's tough, but we will continue to do everything we can to hold the government to account.
Stuart, can I turn to you? And there was that particular question about the NFU's position.
Yeah, and I'll pick up the point from Adam there, and also in particular one from David. Now, for me, I was once asked what three things will have the biggest influence on agriculture in future, and actually the three are fairly straightforward for me. It's trade, trade, and trade. And I think there's a very, very sharp link here with the points David was making about the environment, about biodiversity, around climate change. Because if we do not reflect our values and the values of society, as David says, Daniel says, in terms of where the public are on our standards, and actually all we will do is we will not help the environment, we will just export our consciences and let things happen elsewhere. As a farmer, what do? Yeah, I produce food, that's the core of my business, but I also care for the environment. I also have an aspiration to play my part in net zero. And therefore, anything that can support British agriculture will help all of those things, whether it be food security, whether it be biodiversity, whether it be water quality, all of those things we've got to improve, we've got to invest in, and arguably we cannot afford them to be sacrificed in trade deals. On Adam's point, we are very clear that the Trade and Standards Commission has been a step forward. We need to make sure there is real democracy here. And Daniel, you touched earlier on about parliamentary scrutiny. We are not asking for anything more, actually, than other countries already have. When we looked to do the Japanese trade deal, what happened? Japan went back home, they put it before their parliament, they asked their parliament, are you happy with this? We want that scrutiny. And any amendment that will help give us democratic scrutiny over trade deals, which ultimately look to protect our standards, we will be supporting.
That's great. I'm just pausing. Jackie, let me bring you in next. Particular Welsh angle to those questions.
I will be, well, I'll try and be very, very brief. Can I do an international perspective first, if I may? And that is, you might have heard Ursula von der Leyen talking about environmental standards and the targets that have been set, and they are more progressive than we thought we would have when we were in the European Parliament before we left. And I think that's one to watch. And why I think that's important is because, again, that symbiotic relationship with the UK, but also with the US-UK potential trade deal. And I did go on mission to the US in December of last year and talk to a variety of different actors there. And obviously, if we have a change of government, of president, then things are going to be very different. But in the meantime, we do have to take into account that there's a lot of congressional support for standards, for making sure that the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Northern Ireland Agreement is upheld. And that is something that I think we should be utilising more, not on the back of Northern Irish people, but because there's a standard there to be upheld. And I don't think all US senators or congressional members will want to, if you like, dumb down the standards. That's not the case at all. So it's much more diverse than that. So I think that's one thing that we could potentially utilise. And certainly in Wales, when we talk about law and the Sustainable Development Goals, and also the socio-economic duty coming online in March of 2021, that talks about equalities, and that's the digital exclusion part. So that is coming online, I think, also in Scotland, I believe, but certainly in Wales, and we can utilise that much more. And I talked far longer than I meant to, sorry.
Let me turn to Doina.
Wow, I think the gist of the questions was around how to hold the Tories to account. It'd be lovely if I had what I'd say on this panel would have an influence on that. I suppose just from the local government point of view, really, is, again, going back to what I said about local elections, that's you know, that is the way back towards you know, Labour getting more power. I mean, what I would say is, just generally speaking, as I mentioned this before, is that on the whole question of the environment issues, whether it's around climate change, the catastrophic decline in biodiversity, is that voters are already there. So it's not like you're having to persuade them. That is one of their top concerns. And so Labour just needs to lean into that and do it. And also recognise that, you know, where politics happens now is on values. That is the battleground, isn't it? That's what the Tories do very well. So it's not about just coming up with a nice couple of policies. It's about recognising the values that resonate with people, you know, whether it's about care for your family or care for where you live. And I think that's where Labour really should focus itself, and that's where you can have an impact on people, because people are already there. So it's just, you know, but you know, really go for it, because I mean, this government is a serious danger to not only to this country but to the planet by the fact it's failing to implement the stuff itself it is committed to do around its climate change commitments. So that's what I would say on that aspect.
That's brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions from people who haven't given their names, so I'll just read out a summary of them for you all. First of all, agriculture and food is a huge sector. What should a future Labour government do to encourage inward investment into food processing and manufacturing in Britain? A second anonymous question, back to our main COVID theme, is should food industry workers and their families be included as priorities for testing for COVID-19 to keep the food system going? So those are two where I don't know the names. The next person who I do know the name of is Jane Almond, if she'd like to come in. Have we got Jane on?
Yes, hello.
Hi,
I was just
Jane,
working out how to unmute myself. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you to all on the panel for a really interesting discussion. My question is around obviously the challenges of preparing for Brexit as well as everything else going on. We know that only 3% of food and drink manufacturers feel ready right now to leave the EU, and with only 3 months to go and all the other issues facing them, would the panel support periods of adjustment to help businesses adapt and get ready for the changes? We know that there are many, many unanswered questions that the government aren't able to give us the answers to at the moment. And we know that in the event of a no deal or even a thin deal, there will be so many problems that manufacturers have to deal with in a way that COVID didn't cause the same problems with the supply chain in the spring. So I'd be interested for your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Jane. And I'm going to ask one more person to come in live, and that's Wilfred Legg. Wilfred, can you unmute yourself and we'll bring you in? Go ahead, Wilfred.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, a very, very interesting discussion. And I think the key point about showing in illustrating that COVID can't be separated from the bigger issues. I think that's a very good point. Brexit, climate change, etc. The question I'd like to ask is, as there's relatively low level of food self-sufficiency in Britain, which has had an historical preference for cheap imported food for a long time, which policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic will strengthen the long-term viability of sustainable farming while ensuring affordable and nutritious food to consumers, especially to those that are poor and vulnerable? So helping both the farmers and the consumers at the same time. Thank you.
That's great. So we have questions on self-sufficiency, Brexit, COVID testing and investment. A lot to get our teeth into. Let me start with Doina this time.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yeah, just quickly. So, I mean, on the Brexit one, just as you were talking, I was thinking, you know, we've had so little information as local councils as to what we're supposed to be doing and supporting. I certainly would support transition. So I think that's extremely concerning, is that we don't really know what we personally are supposed to be getting ready for. On the inward investment and the self-sufficiency, I don't know what I've got an easy answer to that one. What I would say is, although this is a government which tends to sort of make a big deal about how patriotic it is and how it has the nation's interests at heart, what I don't really see is a desire to actually defend and to defend British-owned companies, for example, and build that self-sufficiency there. There seems to be quite a happy, you know, let sort of bigger foreign companies come in and build. So I mean, I don't know what the answer to that is, but at least to sort of start that conversation going around self-sufficiency and building back. I mean, I mentioned that one practical example of oat milk, which is burgeoning. I mean, I think that Oatly, which is Swedish based, is just about to so I don't know, it's going public, isn't it? And so it's got huge investment. Why couldn't we have an oat-based production in this country? It seems to be an obvious one. It's obviously a growing market. You know, that's the sort of practical thing that the government should be supporting.
Great. Stuart, over to you. You're on mute.
I was about to say the most used phrase in the last 6 months is "you are on mute." Look, there's a whole range of issues I'd love to pick up there, but I'll just pick up a few. I think on the Brexit issue, clearly the thing we need more than anything is clarity. You know, we are businesses, we can be agile, we can move at pace, but we do need clarity. And I think particularly in terms of trade deals, that's going to be absolutely critical. On the priority for testing, yes, I think there is an important role for food, those of us involved in producing food and putting food on people's plates to be a priority. There are also lots of other priorities, whether that be school children, whether that be teachers, whether that be numerous others. But certainly there is an important there. The bit I'd like to pick up is actually the one about investment in food, food processing and production, and linked with Wilfred's point about food security. And how you balance it with the, if you like, the inequality and the poverty point that I touched on. The first thing I think we need to remember is we produce some of the finest foods in the world, some of the finest standards, and it's often forgotten we have the third most affordable food in the world already. So this argument that we need to chase cheap food around the world, which actually we never pay the real price for because we conveniently forget its environmental impact or its water impact or something else. For me, it's actually about how you then distribute that food and the equality in distribution and where the risks sit. In terms of the investment in food, I think this is a really, really important point. I think one of the opportunities I see going forward is how do we exploit, if you like, the global opportunities for people who are interested in food of provenance, food of quality. Jackie talked earlier on, and Doina talked earlier on about some of the great foods we're producing, wines in Gloucestershire, for example. And actually, if we can invest in our food production and our food processing, I don't then see trade as just a defensive opportunity. I see it as an offensive opportunity, not only to sell quality, but also to sell our values. So to be able to go elsewhere in the world and say, this food not only comes with all of the attributes around animal welfare, around the environment, but comes from an industry that has an aspiration to get to net zero by 2040 and be able to do its bit for climate change, I see as a real opportunity. I get really excited about the food industry. And if we want people to invest in it, then we've got to be excited about it and positive about it ourselves. So yes, there's all of those challenges, and I don't underplay any of them. But I also see some big opportunities going forward, and where there's big opportunities, where there's an exciting sector, where there's a positive, progressive sector, the investment will come.
That's great. Jackie.
Thank you very much. I echo some of the comments already made, definitely, especially by Stuart, and food production, etc. And of course, Welsh whiskey is it's very good. But it's branding as well, of course, and I think that's where a Labour government can also help, and certainly the Welsh government has done so in the past, but and continues to do that. Wales in Europe, you know, food production and all of those things, the brand that is, whatever it might be. So there's work to be done there. I do think that food workers should have priority for testing. Absolutely, I think that makes sense. If we had some tests available, that would be nice too for everyone, not just priority as well. But it's very crucial that we have a much better testing system. When it comes to Brexit and the interesting proposal by Jane talking about periods of adjustments to adapt to changes. I mean, as a lawyer, I can't say yes or no. That's just not in my DNA. It's very interesting, and I would like to see more details, but certainly how we get that through this in 3 months' time, that's going to be a challenge. But being devolved, there might be an opportunity there in different parts of the UK to do something on that scale. I don't know. It's worth Daniel possibly having a look at that in legal terms, if he's so minded to do that. I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
That's great. So Daniel, over to you.
Well, thanks. Let me start with the point about key workers in the food sector. The response at the start of the COVID crisis from the sector in general was absolutely fantastic. There were real worries at the beginning. The Shadow DEFRA team, Luke Pollard, Shadow Secretary of State, we were in calls with the supermarkets and Stuart and others, the NFU, on a virtually daily basis because people were so worried. And it was an extraordinary achievement. But I have to say it was partly because it wasn't quite as bad in terms of sickness levels as people had anticipated. And I don't think that should be taken for granted, that can't happen again. Because exactly as the questioner asked, if children are having to isolate because of an incident at a school, that has a knock-on effect. So this is a very, very serious situation. And we do live with a just-in-time food system. You know, it's only 2 or 3 days. And there are lots of bottlenecks through it. So having the testing working is absolutely critical. Exactly, I think as Stuart said, there are many, many groups and candidates of workers to be priority workers. But I absolutely think that the food sector should qualify because I don't think people realise just quite how precarious the whole system is. On the other issues, yeah, of course we want to encourage investment into the system. All I would say is I think we're looking at quite a substantial structural change going on. In the sense, there's lots of consolidation in different, a lot of this is not transparent to the public. Frankly, it's not transparent to most of us. You ask questions of the supermarkets of how things operate and it's all fairly opaque. And my one worry is that we're moving away from a traditional family farm system towards a very different kind of system. And that will have a knock-on effect on lots of rural areas because anyone who's been on a rural parish council or all the rest of it will know that the local farmer is a key part of the local community often. And when you look at the quite attractive package in the agricultural bill to encourage people to retire, I think there is a story out there from the government which is about changing the way our farming systems are going to work in the future. And I'm not sure the public has fully grasped that. So lots there. Just finally on the Brexit issue, this is absolutely this government's responsibility. You know, the Prime Minister said it was all oven ready back in December, no problem, no difficulty. Well, it's for him to sort this out now. I'm deeply worried because I don't think he has got it sorted out. We may end up with a very thin deal in a few months' time. But what I'm hearing from a lot of people in the sector is that contracts are drawn up months in advance. You know, it's not waiting till December. Decisions are being made now, and this is costing the country hugely. So this is entirely responsibility of the Conservative government. They need to sort it out. I'm in no doubt that, you know, the vast majority of our trade and food is with our European neighbours, and that's the way it's going to stay in the future. And we shouldn't be in this position, but we will behave constructively and positively to try and get the country out of the mess the Conservatives have put it in, but be in no doubt whose responsibility it is.
That's great, Daniel. And Daniel, can I just ask you one more question just before we close, which is what's your message overall to people in farming communities as to why they should in future vote Labour, given they haven't been for such a long time?
Because I think the change I'm describing is not a change that would be welcome to many people in farming and rural areas. I don't think it's fully got through to people, the kind of scale of change. And to some extent, it's been crystallised around the trade standards issue, but it's part, I think, of a vision that some in government have for a very, very different system for the future. And I don't think it's one that most people would want. And I think it's a very good reason to go back to Labour, because we don't want that either. The question of market volatility perhaps wasn't talked about quite as much, but you know, this is a very, very hostile world we're sailing into, having left the European Union, and the responsibility is going to be falling on individuals because the government doesn't believe in intervention. Well, Labour does, and we will give people the security that I think they want.
That's brilliant. Well, thanks to all our speakers. It's been a really brilliant discussion, starting with COVID, but going much wider as well. It's an area the Fabian Society is monitoring closely, and we'll be particularly coming back to future work, which we've done in the past, on how to reconnect the Labour Party in rural communities. Do check out our report from 3 years ago on this subject. Sadly, nothing has changed, or perhaps things have got worse. I'd like to say a really big thank you to the NFU as well for supporting this event and making it possible. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your Labour Connected experience, and we'll see you at another Fabian event very soon. Thank you.